The hospital director had never run before. She had walked quickly through corridors. She had moved with the specific, purposeful efficiency of a person who has been directing the operations of a large institution for 11 years, and who understands that speed of movement communicates urgency to the people around her. She had done a version of walking faster. She had not run. She ran on the morning of the incident. She ran because she had understood in the 6 seconds between the end of the security officer's call and the moment she stepped into the corridor exactly what was happening. Not the legal specifics and not the protocol violations. Those would take 3 weeks to document precisely. She had understood in 6 seconds what it meant that a nurse who had been employed by this hospital for 14 years and whose ID was verified in the system and who was standing at the staff entrance in her uniform was not inside the building. It meant that the officer at the staff entrance had decided before examining the available evidence that the available evidence was not sufficient. She had known from 22 years in medicine and hospital administration what that decision looked like. She had run. She had received a call from the security desk at the main entrance at 7:41 in the morning. The security officer had said, "Dr. Whitfield, I need to advise you that there is a situation at the staff entrance on the Callahan Street side. A police officer is detaining a nurse who is trying to enter the building for her shift. Her ID checks out in our system. She is in uniform. The officer is saying the ID is not valid." Dr. Whitfield had asked which nurse. The security officer had said the name. Dr. Whitfield had said, "I know her. I will be there in 4 minutes." She had been there in 2.5. She had been running. The nurse's name was Diane Osei. She was 41 years old, and she had been working as a registered nurse at Meridian City General Hospital for 14 years. She had worked in the cardiac care unit for the last 9 of those 14 years. She was certified in advanced cardiac life support and critical care nursing, and in 2 additional specialty certifications that had taken her a combined 4 years of additional training and examination to obtain. She had a patient load that morning of 4 post-operative cardiac patients, one of whom had had a valve replacement surgery the previous afternoon, and who was in the specific delicate phase of post-surgical recovery that required precisely the kind of experienced credentialed nursing attention that Diane Osei provided. She had arrived at the staff entrance at 7:38 in the morning, 3 minutes before her scheduled shift, which was the standard by which she operated. She arrived early enough to receive the shift handoff properly, to review the overnight notes, and to be fully oriented before her patient's care fell to her, rather than to the overnight nurse. She had her hospital ID badge on the lanyard at her chest. She had her name badge. She had her CCU identification tag, which indicated her unit assignment. She had her nursing credentials card in the front pocket of her scrubs, which she carried, not because she was regularly asked to produce it, but because she had understood from 14 years of working in a system that did not always immediately see her the way the credential card said she was, that it was useful to have. The credential card had been issued by the state's nursing board. It was laminated 3 inches by 5 inches, with her name, her license number, her license classification, her specialty certifications, and the date of her most recent renewal. It was not the kind of document that an ordinary person carried to work every day. It was the kind of document that a person carried because the ordinary documents, the badge on the lanyard, the name tag, the CCU identification, had not always been sufficient. She had started carrying it in her 3rd year at Meridian City General. That had been the year in which a physician's assistant in the general medical unit had twice in 1 week directed questions that were specifically for the attending nurse to a white colleague who was standing nearby, rather than to Diane, who was the nurse of record for the patient in question. She had not made a scene. She had addressed the issue in the correct channel. She had also gone home and thought about what her toolkit for navigating those situations was, and had added the credential card to it. The credential card was not a declaration. It was a tool. It was the tool she reached for when the badge on the lanyard was not being accepted. She had said to Sandra Park on the day they had discussed the registry, "I carry the credential card because there are moments when the badge is not enough. Not because it should not be enough, because it sometimes is not. The credential card has more information, more credentials, more authority. It is harder to dismiss than the badge. So I carry it." Sandra had said, "I carry mine too." Diane had said, "When did you start?" Sandra had said, "Second year." She had looked at Diane. She had said, "We all do." Diane had not been surprised. She had been again relieved. She had said, "We all carry the extra proof." Sandra had said, "Because the badge is not always enough." Diane had said, "And the badge should be enough." Sandra had said, "Yes, it should be enough, and it is not always, and so we carry more." They had been quiet together for a moment. Diane had said, "The registry." Sandra had said, "Yes." Diane had said, "The registry is the proof that the badge should be enough." Sandra had said, "And the proof that it is not." Diane had said, "And the proof that we filed the complaint when it was not." Sandra had said, "Yes." That was what the credential card was. That was what the registry was. That was what the complaint filed precisely and in the correct channel was. They were all the same thing. They were all the accurate answer put in the format the system was required to process by the nurses who had understood what the situation required and who had done what it required and who had added their entry to the record so that the nurse who came after would not have to discover it from the beginning. She had been reaching for her key card to open the staff entrance door when Officer Marcus Teller had stepped in front of her. He had said, "Can I see some identification?" She had felt the specific locating clarity that she had been trained for by her mother's precise instruction and her father's example, and 14 years of doing work in a system that had not always seen her the way her credentials said she was. She had not been surprised. She had noted it. She had been clear about what was happening and what the correct response was, and what she needed to accomplish in the next several minutes to get inside the building and to her patients. She had shown him her hospital ID badge. He had looked at it. He had said, "I need to see something else." She had thought, "I have 4 patients. One of them had valve replacement surgery 18 hours ago." She had said, "I have a nursing credentials card as well. But, officer, I have a shift that starts in 2 minutes. I have patients. I need to get inside." He had said, "I need to verify that this badge is legitimate." She had said, "It is a Meridian City General Hospital ID badge. You can see the hospital's name, my photograph, my name, my unit assignment, and my employee number. If you need to verify it, the security desk is inside the main entrance on the Meridian Street side." He had said, "I am going to need you to step back from the door." She had stepped back. She had not been afraid, because she had done enough years of nursing in enough different contexts to understand the difference between a situation that required fear and a situation that required clarity. And this was a situation that required clarity. She was standing at the staff entrance of the hospital where she worked. She had her credentials. The security officer at the main desk had her employee number in the system. This was going to be resolved. She had also been thinking about her patients, specifically about the valve replacement patient, 18 hours post-operative, whose morning vitals she was supposed to have by 8 o'clock, and about whether the deviation in his pain description that the overnight notes had flagged was within the expected range or was the beginning of something else. She had not been standing at the staff entrance thinking about the officer. She had been standing there waiting for the resolution while the clinical part of her mind was already at the patient's bedside. She had also thought while she was waiting, "I'm going to write this down tonight." Precisely. Everything, the time and the words and the exchange. "I'm going to write it down while it is clear, and I'm going to file it in the correct channel." She had thought that at 7:41. It had taken until 9:15 to begin writing. The writing had taken until 11:42. The account had been 2 pages. It had been precise. It had said everything it needed to say. She had been waiting to get into the building for her shift for 4 minutes, when the security officer at the main entrance had called Dr. Whitfield. She had been waiting for 7 minutes when the security officer had come around from the main entrance to the Callahan Street side and had said to Officer Teller, "This is Diane Osei. She works in our cardiac care unit. I have verified her employee number in the system. She is due on shift." Officer Teller had said, "I need to verify the badge directly." The security officer had said, "I have verified her employee record. The badge matches the employee record." Officer Teller had said, "I received a call that there was someone using a fraudulent badge at this entrance." The security officer had said, "Who reported that?" Officer Teller had said, "I cannot disclose the source of the complaint." The security officer had said, "The badge is not fraudulent. She is our employee. She needs to be at work." Officer Teller had said, "Until I can verify the badge directly with the hospital's credentialing office, I cannot allow her to enter." The security officer had said, "Our credentialing office does not open until 8:30. Officer Teller had said then she waits until it opens. It was 7:45 in the morning. 8:30 was in 45 minutes. Diane's shift had started 5 minutes ago. In the cardiac care unit, a nurse named Priya Chakrabarty, who had worked the overnight shift and who was scheduled to hand off to Diane at 7:45, was still at her station, waiting, having called the unit charge nurse at 7:42 to report that Diane had not arrived for the handoff. Priya had been in the cardiac care unit for 4 years. She had come to the night shift by choice. She had a child in elementary school and a schedule arrangement with her husband that made the night shift more workable for their family than any day arrangement would have been. And she had found in 4 years of nights in the cardiac care unit that the night shift had its own specific rhythms and demands that suited her particular strengths. She was thorough and she was quiet. And she was the kind of nurse who noticed small things at 2 in the morning when the things that needed to be noticed were small and the consequences of not noticing them were large. She had been Diane's patient for an hour before the handoff was supposed to happen. She had done the 7:30 vital check on all 4 of Diane's patients. The valve replacement patient had been asleep. His vitals had been within normal range. She had noted them in the chart and had returned to the nursing station to prepare the handoff documentation, which was the specific detailed summary of each patient's overnight that Diane would receive at 7:45 and use to orient herself to the current state of each patient's recovery. At 7:42, Priya had noted that Diane had not arrived. She had not been worried. She had been attentive. Diane was not a person who ran late. But things happened, and the way that things happening was handled was that you noted it, and you called the charge nurse and you waited. She had called. The charge nurse had said she is never late. Priya had said, I know. The charge nurse had called the security desk. That was the call that had reached Dr. Whitfield. Priya had handed Diane the overnight notes in the elevator. She had said Walter Grimes in 14 is stable. 7:30 vitals were good. He slept in segments. The wound site is clean. Diane had said his description of the ache was different this morning. Priya had said different in what way? Diane had told her. Priya had said that is consistent with what I saw in his movement during the night. He was more restless from 2 to 4. I noted it. It is in the chart. And Diane had said good. They had reached the floor. Diane had gone to her patients. Priya had gone home. That was the handoff. That was how it worked when everything worked correctly. That was also how it worked when something had been wrong for 6 minutes at the staff entrance and had then been corrected. You got the notes in the elevator, and you went to your patients. The charge nurse had said she is never late. Priya had said, I know. The charge nurse had called the security desk. That was the call that had reached Dr. Whitfield. Dr. Whitfield was 53 years old and had been the executive director of Meridian City General Hospital for 11 years. She had a medical degree and an MBA and had spent 22 years working in hospital administration after a decade as a practicing physician in internal medicine. She was not, by the nature of her position, typically involved in the resolution of situations at the staff entrance. She resolved budget disputes and regulatory compliance issues and strategic planning questions and the specific complex category of personnel matters that her department heads could not resolve at their level. She had never in 11 years run to the staff entrance. She had run. She arrived at the Callahan Street entrance at 7:43, having covered the distance from her office in 2.5 minutes, and she was not out of breath when she arrived because she had been walking quickly through corridors for 11 years, and her body knew how to move with purpose, and she had said, Officer, I am Dr. Meredith Whitfield. I am the executive director of this hospital. Diane Osei is a registered nurse on our cardiac care staff. She has been employed here for 14 years. Her credentials are valid. I am personally authorizing her entry into this building. Officer Teller had looked at her. He had said, Ma'am, I received a complaint about a fraudulent badge. I am required to investigate the complaint before I can. She had said, the complaint is unfounded. The badge is real. The employee is real. She has 4 post-operative cardiac patients on the floor who need her. I am the director of this hospital, and I am telling you this nurse belongs inside this building. Teller had said, I understand, ma'am, but procedure requires. She had said, I know what procedure requires. If you need a formal statement from the hospital confirming the validity of this employee's credentials, I will provide one. In the meantime, Diane Osei is going to her unit. She had looked at Diane. She had said, go. Diane had gone. The time was 7:44. She had been detained at her own hospital's staff entrance for 6 minutes. Priya had handed off the overnight notes in the elevator. She had said Walter Grimes in 14 is stable, but his pain description changed overnight. I noted it. It is in the chart. I would prioritize him first. Diane had said I was going to. Priya had said I know. They had reached the floor. Diane had been at her patient's bedside at 7:47. The patient had had a valve replacement surgery the previous afternoon. He had needed Diane Osei at 7:45. He had gotten her at 7:47. Diane Osei had been born in Accra, Ghana, the second of 4 children of a civil engineer and a secondary school English teacher. Her father, whose name was Kwame Osei, had come to the United States in 1981 on an engineering fellowship at a university in the Mid-Atlantic region and had spent 38 years working in infrastructure design, bridges, highways, drainage systems, in a career that had produced 47 major projects across 6 states, and that had been in its specific quiet way the career of a man who had decided that the thing he was going to do with the education he had received was to build things that would outlast him. Kwame Osei had grown up in Accra in a household that understood education as both a personal achievement and a community obligation. His father had been a headmaster at a secondary school in the city's eastern district for 27 years, and had held the specific considered belief that education was not merely the acquisition of information, but the development of a person's capacity to think independently in a system that would not always reward independent thought. He had passed this belief to his children through the specific mechanism of asking at the dinner table not what they had learned that day, but what they had thought about what they had learned. Kwame had thought carefully. He had gone to the University of Ghana on scholarship, had studied civil engineering, and had been selected in his final year for the fellowship that had brought him to the United States. The fellowship had been in bridge engineering, the structural mechanics of bridges, the specific problem of how to build something that would bear continuous dynamic loads over decades without failing. He had spent 38 years thinking about that problem in 6 states, and had built 47 projects and had retired at 64 with the specific, quiet satisfaction of a man who could drive across bridges he had built and know that the bridge would be there after he was gone. He had told Diane when she was 9 years old and had asked him what a civil engineer did I build things that people use without thinking about them. When the bridge works, no one thinks about the bridge. They just cross. The bridge being invisible is the point. She had said that sounds lonely. He had said it sounds like it. But it is not. The person crossing the bridge without thinking about it is safe. That is the point, not the credit. The crossing. She had thought about that for many years. She had thought about it in the cardiac care unit when a patient was stable, when the monitor was steady, when the post-operative recovery was progressing the way it was supposed to progress, and the patient was not thinking about the nurse who had checked his vitals at 3 in the morning and had adjusted his medication and had caught the early sign of the thing that would have been a problem if she had not caught it. The patient was just recovering. The nurse was the bridge. She had said once to her colleague Sandra Park, who had been in nursing for 22 years, I think of myself as infrastructure. Sandra had said that is a very specific way to think of yourself. Diane had said my father is a civil engineer. Sandra had said that explains it. He had said to Diane when she was 14 and had told him she wanted to be a doctor. Why a doctor? She had said because I want to help people when they are sick. He had said that is a good reason. It is also a difficult job. The people you help will not always get better. She had said, I know. He had said, and when they do not get better, you will still have to be the nurse. She had said, I know. He had said that is the harder part, not the knowledge, the staying. He had also said, a nurse is different from a doctor in one specific way that I want you to understand. A doctor makes the decision. A nurse is present for the execution of the decision and for what happens after. The nurse is the one who is there, not in the making of the plan, but in the living of the plan hour by hour with the patient. That is the part that requires the most from a person. Not the knowledge. The staying. She had said, I know. He had said, you do not know yet. You will know. She had been 41 years old and 9 years into the cardiac care unit and had understood in those 9 years exactly what he had meant. Her mother, whose name was Abena Osei, had been an English teacher in Accra for 22 years before the family had moved to the United States. She had retaken her teaching certification in the state where they settled a process that had required her to retest her subject knowledge in a system that did not automatically recognize her 22 years of classroom experience, and had spent the following 19 years teaching English and literature at a public high school in the county where they lived, and had been in those 19 years the specific kind of teacher who is remembered not for the texts she had taught, but for what she had taught her students to do with them, to read carefully, to think about what the text was doing, and why to consider the gap between what a sentence said and what it meant. She had said to Diane in Diane's first year of nursing school, when Diane had come home for a holiday and had been frustrated by a professor who had, in Abena's assessment of what Diane was describing, dismissed a question that had been a good question in a way that had communicated that the student who asked it was not worth engaging with seriously. "What did you do with the question?" Diane had said, "I asked it anyway." Abena had said, "What happened?" Diane had said he gave a partial answer and moved on. Abena had said, "Did you get what you needed?" Diane had said, "No, I looked it up afterward." Abena had said, "That is the right response." She had said the question was worth asking. That does not depend on whether the professor was worth the question. She had also said in a different conversation in Diane's third year of nursing school, when Diane had described a clinical rotation incident in which a patient had questioned whether she was actually a nursing student rather than someone there in some other capacity. "What did you want to say to him?" Diane had said, "I wanted to say that I have been in this program for 2.5 years, and that my clinical evaluations are in the top quartile of my cohort, and that I have passed every examination on the first attempt, and that his question was not actually about whether I was a nursing student." Abena had said, "And why did you not say it?" Diane had said, "Because it would not have helped in that moment." Abena had said, "That is a correct assessment, but I want you to notice something. You know the accurate answer. You held it precisely. The reason you did not say it is not that you did not know it. It is that the moment did not provide a channel where saying it would produce a result. But knowing the accurate answer clearly without ambiguity is the foundation of what happens next. When the moment comes where the accurate answer needs to be in a format the system is required to process, you put it there, precisely, in the correct channel." Diane had said the correct channel. Abena had said the complaint form, the supervisor's review, the professional registry, whatever the process is. You put the accurate answer there precisely in the format the system recognizes. That is how the record gets made. Diane had carried that. She had carried it into 14 years of nursing and into the specific moments in those 14 years when the institution she was working within had not immediately recognized what she was, and she had needed to proceed anyway, not above the institution's processes and not around them, but through them, with precision and with the quiet authority of a person who knew what she knew. Diane had entered nursing school at 22, having spent 2 years after her undergraduate degree working as a patient care technician at a hospital in the city where she had gone to school. The 2 years had not been required. She had chosen them because she had wanted to understand what the daily reality of a hospital ward was before she committed to a career inside one, and because she had believed a belief she had acquired from her father's example, from watching him spend a year as a junior engineer on a bridge project before he took on his first lead role, that the way to understand a system was to be inside it at the entry level before you were in a position to make decisions within it. She had been a patient care technician for 2 years. Those 2 years had been in the way that formative experiences are always clearer in retrospect than they are at the time, the years in which she had understood what she was choosing when she chose nursing. Not in the abstract, she had understood it abstractly before she had started the job, but in the specific, concrete daily way of a person who has been inside the thing and who knows from the inside what it requires. It had required presence, not the presence of being in the room that was the minimum, the presence of actually being with the person in the room. The presence of knowing when you walked through the door what the person in that room needed in that moment and how to provide it, and what would happen next. She had watched the nurses. She had watched the good ones and the ones who were adequate, and the ones who were doing the job at the minimum standard, and the ones who were doing it at a level that could not have been written into a job description, because the written description would have called it care. And the nurses who were really doing it were providing something more specific than care, and less vague than compassion. They were providing their full professional attention sustained across a 12-hour shift for a person who could not provide it for themselves. She had understood at the end of those 2 years 3 things. The first was that the nurses were the ones who knew the patients, not the physicians who came in and made decisions and left, not the technicians who performed specific tasks and documented them and moved on. The nurses. The nurses were the ones who were there for the full shift, who knew which patient always needed the call. Light moved to the left hand because the right hand had the IV, and which patient's family would arrive at exactly 9 in the morning every day and would need to be spoken with before they went in, and which patient was frightened in a way they were not showing because they did not want to seem difficult. The second was that this knowledge was not incidental to the nursing role. It was the nursing role. The clinical skills were the foundation. The knowledge of the specific person in the bed was the structure that made the clinical skills matter. The third was that she wanted to be a nurse. She had gone to nursing school at 24. She had graduated at 27. She had passed her licensing examination on the first attempt. She had been hired at Meridian City General Hospital at 27 and had worked in the general medical unit for the first 5 years, building the clinical foundation that would support the specialty work she was already planning. The 5 years in the general medical unit had been the years in which Diane Osei had learned from actual practice rather than from coursework what nursing was in the way that it could only be understood from inside it. She had learned that the work was not uniform. It was not the same from patient to patient, shift to shift, or even hour to hour. Each patient was a specific problem that required a specific approach, and the approach was not determined only by the diagnosis, but by the specific person who had the diagnosis, their history, their anxiety, their tolerance for discomfort, their relationship to the people around them, the specific way they communicated when they were in pain versus when they were managing. She had learned that the physical skill was not the hardest part. The hardest part was the sustained attention, not the acute attention that a crisis required that was adrenaline and most people could do it. The sustained attention, the attention that was the same at the beginning of the shift and at the end, the attention that noticed the patient who was slightly less verbal than they had been 3 hours ago and who needed to be asked about it, the attention that maintained its quality across a 12-hour shift in a unit where something was always demanding it. She had developed that attention in 5 years in the general medical unit. She had also, in those 5 years, had 3 specific experiences that had shaped her understanding of what the nursing credential represented and what it required her to do with it. The first had been in her 2nd year when a physician attending had, during a patient care discussion in front of 3 other nurses and 2 physicians, dismissed a concern Diane had raised about a patient's pain presentation, with a comment that had been, in its specific wording, a dismissal not only of the concern, but of the nurse who had raised it. She had not raised the concern again in that setting. She had raised it in the written nursing note. She had said in the note patient reports, pain presentation inconsistent with expected post-procedure pattern. Recommend attending physician review for non-standard trajectory. The attending had reviewed it. The attending had ordered the test that the note, without requesting it directly, had indicated was warranted. The test had found what Diane had thought it would find. The patient had been treated. The physician had not, in any of the subsequent conversations that Diane had had with him over the following months, ever referenced the note or the test or what it had found. She had not expected him to. She had put the accurate answer in the correct channel. The second experience had been in her 4th year, when a patient's family member had questioned in front of several other families in the waiting area whether Diane was the nurse assigned to their loved one, or whether there was a more senior nurse available. She had said in a voice that was clear and direct and not loud, "I am Diane Osei. I am the registered nurse assigned to your family member. I have been in this unit for 4 years. If you have concerns about your family member's care, I am glad to discuss them. If you would prefer to speak with my charge nurse, I can bring her. What would you like?" The family member had said, "I would like to know what is happening." She had told them. They had been satisfied. She had documented the conversation in the incident log precisely. The third experience had been in her 5th year when she had received a performance review that included a notation in the communication category that was 1 grade below her ratings in every other category. The notation was not accompanied by a specific incident or specific examples. She had sat with the notation for a day. She had then scheduled a meeting with her unit manager and had brought to the meeting a written list of 5 specific instances from the preceding 12 months in which her communication with patients, with families, with physicians, with her nursing colleagues had produced a clear, documented positive outcome. She had laid the list on the table. She had said, "I want to understand what specific element of my communication this notation refers to. If there is a pattern or an incident that I am not aware of, I want to know about it so I can address it. If the notation is not based on a specific observation, I want that to be reflected in the review." The unit manager had reviewed the instances. The notation had been revised. Diane had gone back to work. She had applied for a position in the cardiac care unit at 32. The unit manager at the time had been a man named Harold Okafor, who had been managing the cardiac care unit for 11 years and who had a reputation within the hospital for being demanding. In a way that was not performative. He expected precision from his nurses, not because precision was the hospital's policy, but because imprecision in cardiac care produced outcomes that could not be undone. He had interviewed Diane. He had asked her at the end of the interview why cardiac care. She had said because the margin is the narrowest and the standard is therefore the highest. He had been quiet for a moment. He had said, "Most people tell me they are passionate about the heart." She had said, "I am interested in the work. The work is precise. The consequences of imprecision are serious, and I want to work in an environment where the standard for what I do is clear and where the consequences of meeting or not meeting that standard are real." He had said, "What do you do when you are not sure what the standard requires?" She had said, "I ask someone who knows." He had said, "And if no one on the unit knows." She had said, "I find the resource. I call the attending. I look it up. I do not proceed without the answer." He had hired her. Harold Okafor had been in Diane's 9 years in the unit the most influential supervisor she had encountered in 14 years of nursing. This was not because he had been the warmest or the most encouraging or the most supportive. He had been none of those things precisely, though he had been consistent and fair, and had communicated clearly, and had never in the 3 years she had worked under him before his retirement made a decision about her career based on anything other than the quality of her work. He had been influential because he had been specific. Every conversation he had had with Diane about her performance had been specific. Not you could improve your communication. But in the handoff conversation this morning, you described the patient's pain presentation using language that was accurate, but that did not include the specific descriptor that the oncoming nurse would need to know which deviation to watch for. Use this specific terminology next time. She had used the specific terminology. He had also been specific about what the unit required in a way that no one before him had been specific with her about. He had said in her first month, "This unit has a standard. The standard is not the hospital's standard. The hospital's standard is adequate for most units. Our standard is specific to cardiac care because the consequences of falling below it in cardiac care are irreversible in ways that they are not in most units. You are going to learn the specific ways in which our standard exceeds the hospital's standard, and you are going to meet our standard and you are going to maintain it every shift, not because I am watching, but because the patients require it." She had said, "I understand." He had said, "You will understand more fully in 6 months." He had been right. He had also said in her 2nd year during a performance review that was the first review she had had in the unit, "There is one thing I want to address that is not in the performance metrics." She had said yes. He had said, "I have observed that when a physician dismisses something you have noted, you do not re-raise it in the same conversation. You put it in the chart." She had said yes. He had said that is correct. "But I want you to understand why it is correct, because nurses in your position sometimes do it out of deference and sometimes do it out of strategy, and the difference matters." She had said it is strategy. He had said explain. She had said the note is the form that the physician is required to review and respond to. The verbal comment in the room is not. If I raise the concern verbally and it is dismissed, the record says I raised it and it was dismissed. If I put it in the note, the record says I raised it in the required format and the physician reviewed it. The physician's response to the note is also documented. If the physician does not respond to the note, that is also documented. Harold had been quiet for a moment. He had said, "That is correct." He had said, "I want you to remember that in every situation in which the note is not producing the result the patient needs, there is also an escalation pathway. The charge nurse, the attending, the department head, the risk management office. The note is not the end of the pathway. It is the beginning." She had said, "I know." He had said, "You are going to need to use the whole pathway at some point in your career." She had said, "I know." He had retired 2 years after that conversation. He had hired her. He had told her on her first day in the unit the cardiac care environment is specific. The patients are frequently post-operative, which means their baselines are disrupted and their trajectories are non-linear. You will learn to read the difference between a deviation that requires intervention and a deviation that is within the expected range for the recovery. That learning takes time. You are not expected to have it on day 1. You are expected to ask when you do not have it. She had asked. She had learned. Harold had retired after her 3rd year in the unit. The unit manager who had replaced him was a woman named Ruth Svensson, who had been in cardiac nursing for 26 years and who had a different style from Harold, more collaborative, more openly supportive, but who shared his fundamental belief that the standard in the unit was non-negotiable and that the nurses who could not maintain it needed to be helped to either meet it or find a different unit. Diane had met the standard. In 9 years in the cardiac care unit, she had not received a single adverse incident report. She had received 2 commendations from the hospital's Patient Experience Committee submitted by patients who had written specifically about her care during their recovery. She had received a department-wide commendation from Harold's successor when she had been the first nurse in the unit to identify an early post-operative sign of anastomotic leak in a patient who had had a coronary artery bypass and who had gone on to receive intervention that the attending had confirmed was timely in a way that had changed the patient's outcome. She had not documented that commendation in her credentials file. She had not mentioned it when she described herself to people she did not know well. She had mentioned it once to her daughter, who had asked, "What is the most important thing you have done at work?" Diane had thought about it. She had said, "I caught something early once that mattered a great deal to the person I caught it for." Her daughter had said, "What did you catch?" She had set a sign that something was going wrong that nobody else had noticed yet. Her daughter had said, "How did you know?" She had said, "I had been watching closely for a long time." Her daughter had said what happened to the person. She had said he recovered. Her daughter had said, "Because of you." She had said, "Because of the team." I was the one who noticed first. She had also been the person who other nurses in the unit came to when they had a question they did not want to bring to the charge nurse because they were not sure if the question was worth bringing to the charge nurse. She had made it clear that no question was not worth asking. She had said to a nurse in her 3rd year who had prefaced a question with, "I do not know if this is worth bringing to you." She had said, "If you are asking it, it is worth asking. The question is already in you. Ask it." The nurse had asked. The question had revealed something that needed to be addressed in the patient's chart. She had also, in 9 years, mentored 4 nurses who had come to the cardiac care unit as new graduates or transfers from other units, and who had needed the specific guidance of someone who knew the unit's expectations and the unit's rhythms and the specific non-obvious things that the cardiac care environment required. One of those nurses was now the unit's charge nurse. Her name was Kezia. She had come to the unit 7 years ago, 23 years old, fresh from her licensing examination with the specific combination of confidence and uncertainty that characterizes new nurses who have passed their examinations and who are not yet sure what passing the examination means in the context of a real patient who is really sick. Diane had been her assigned mentor for the first year. She had told Kezia on their first day working together, "There are 2 things I want you to understand about this unit. The first is that the patient in this bed is not the patient in the textbook. The patient in this bed is a specific person with a specific history and a specific trajectory, and you need to know all 3 to do this job correctly." The second is that not knowing something is not a failure. Not asking because you do not want to seem like you do not know something is the failure. Ask. Always ask, Kezia had asked. She had learned. She was now the charge nurse who had called the security desk at 7:42 on the morning of the incident when Diane had not arrived for the handoff. She had said she is never late. She had been right. Diane had been detained at the staff entrance by Officer Teller. She had been 41 years old and 9 years into the cardiac care unit, and she had stood at the staff entrance on the Callahan Street side and had waited clearly for the situation to be resolved. She had filed a complaint that afternoon. She had filed it through the hospital's Human Resources Department, through the police department's Community Relations Office, and through the state's nursing board, which had a process for documenting incidents in which a nurse's professional credentials had been challenged without cause. She had also written a 2-page personal account that evening at her kitchen table beginning at 9:15 after her daughter was asleep and ending at 11:42, in which she had described the incident in precise, careful language, the time she had arrived, the time the officer had approached her. The specific words of each exchange, the time Dr. Whitfield had arrived, the time she had reached her patient's bedside. The evening before she had written the account had been a particular evening. She had come home at 6:15, which was her usual time after a day shift. Her daughter, whose name was Amara, was 9 years old and had been at school and then at the after-school program at the community center on the next street. Amara's grandmother, Diane's mother Abena, who had retired from teaching the previous year and who had moved to be closer to Diane and Amara after Diane's marriage had ended 3 years earlier, had picked Amara up and had them both home and fed by the time Diane arrived. Diane had come through the kitchen door and had set her bag down and had stood in the kitchen for a moment. Abena had looked at her. She had said, "Tell me." Diane had sat down. She had told her. Abena had been quiet for a long time. She had said, "What did you think about while you were standing there?" Diane had said, "I thought about my patients. I thought about the valve replacement from the night before. I thought about whether Priya had done the 7:30 vital check and what the numbers had looked like." Abena had said, "What else?" Diane had said, "I thought about the credential card in my pocket and about whether to take it out and show it to him, and I decided not to because I wanted him to understand that the badge on the lanyard was sufficient, and showing the credential card would have communicated that I agreed that it was not." Abena had said that was precise. Diane had said I was precise about what I could be precise about. Abena had said yes. She had been quiet for another moment. She had said, "You are going to write it down." Diane had said, "I know." Abena had said all of it. The time and the words and the patience. All of it. Diane had said, "I know, Mama." Amara had come in from the living room. She had said, "Mama, are you okay?" Diane had looked at her daughter for a moment. She had said, "I am fine." Amara had said, "Grandma said something happened at work." Diane had said something happened that needed to be handled. It was handled. "I am fine." Amara had said, "Are you sure?" Diane had said, "Come here." Amara had come. Diane had put her arm around her daughter and had held her for a moment in the specific way that you hold a 9-year-old when you are a 41-year-old woman who has had a long day and who is glad more than anything to be home. Amara had said, "You smell like work." Diane had said, "I know, I am going to shower." She had showered. She had eaten. She had put Amara to bed at 8:30. She had sat with Amara for 15 minutes after the lights were out, as she always did, while Amara talked about her day in the specific unhurried way of a 9-year-old who has not yet learned to be efficient about the telling of things and who does not yet need to be. Amara had talked about a conflict at school involving 2 friends in a pencil case. She had talked about a reading assignment she had found boring and another she had found interesting. She had said, "Mama, do you like your job?" Diane had said yes. Amara had said, "Even when bad things happen." Diane had said, "The bad things do not change whether I like the job. The job is the job. The bad things are separate." Amara had said, "How do you keep them separate?" Diane had thought about it. She had said, "You know how you can have a hard day at school and still like school." Amara had said, "I guess." Diane had said, "It is the same. A hard thing happens and you handle it the way you are supposed to handle it, and then you go back to the thing you were doing before, the hard thing. The thing you were doing before is still the thing you are doing. The hard thing was an interruption. You do not let the interruption change the thing." Amara had been quiet. She had said, "Did someone give you a hard time today?" Diane had said yes. Amara had said, "And you handled it?" Diane had said I handled it. Dr. Whitfield helped. Amara had said, "Who is Dr. Whitfield?" Diane had said the director of the hospital. She ran to help me. Amara had said she ran. Diane had said she ran. Amara had been quiet. She had said she sounds like a good person. Diane had said she is. She had said goodnight to Amara. She had gone to the kitchen table. She had started writing at 9:15. She had written the 2-page account with the specific, precise language of a person who has been told by her mother years ago that the accurate answer needs to be in the correct channel, in the format the system is required to process, and who has understood that the format is precision, and the channel is the complaint form and the nursing board registry and the personal account that goes in the folder in the filing cabinet, and that will be there if it is ever needed. She had noted in the second page of the account I was 2 minutes late to a patient who had had valve replacement surgery 18 hours earlier. In cardiac post-operative care, 2 minutes is not nothing. I was delayed not because I was late, not because I had done anything wrong, but because an officer had received a complaint about a fraudulent badge and had decided, before reviewing any of the available evidence, that the nurse standing at the staff entrance of the hospital where she worked in uniform with credentials with her name badge was the person the complaint was describing. She had put the account in a folder. She had put the folder in the filing cabinet. She had gone to bed. She had been at work at 7:38 the following morning. Officer Marcus Teller was 33 years old and had been with the Meridian City Police Department for 5 years. He had grown up in the county's northern suburbs, the son of a high school football coach and a dental hygienist, and had come to police work through a path that was common. He had attended the community college for 2 years, had found the criminal justice coursework interesting, and had been hired in a cohort of 22 officers. He had been assigned to the district that included Meridian City General Hospital for 14 months. He had not in 14 months had occasion to go to the staff entrance on the Callahan Street side for a fraudulent ID complaint. The call had come in at 7:36 in the morning. Anonymous. Non-emergency. A person at the staff entrance using a fraudulent badge. No description of the person. He had arrived at 7:40 and had found a woman in nursing scrubs at the staff entrance with a hospital ID badge on her lanyard, a name badge, and a CCU identification tag. She was in every visible indicator exactly what she said she was. He had asked for identification. She had shown him the badge. He had said he needed something else. He could not say when the investigation asked him what about the badge appeared fraudulent. He had said the complaint said the badge was fraudulent. The investigation had noted the complaint said the badge was fraudulent. The complaint did not provide a description of the person using the fraudulent badge. Officer Teller arrived and approached the first person he saw at the staff entrance. The photograph on the badge matched the person presenting it. There was no visible indicator that the badge was not a legitimate hospital ID. Officer Teller's basis for finding the badge insufficient was not a specific observation. It was the existence of the complaint. The complaint was investigated by the police department's Community Relations Division, a process that took 3 weeks. The investigating officer, a captain named Lorraine Abrams, had interviewed Officer Teller, the security officer from Meridian City General Dr. Whitfield, and 2 witnesses who had been in the vicinity of the staff entrance during the incident. Teller had said in his interview that he had received a call to the non-emergency line reporting a person using a fraudulent badge at the hospital's staff entrance, and that his response had been in accordance with standard procedure for investigating a fraudulent identification complaint. Captain Abrams had asked when the security officer from the hospital confirmed the employee record, "What information did you receive?" Teller had said the security officer confirmed that the name matched a record in the hospital's employee database. Abrams had asked, and that confirmation was not sufficient for you to allow her to enter. Teller had said, "I felt the confirmation should come from the hospital's credentialing office, not from the security desk." Abrams had asked, "Was there a specific reason you felt the security desk's confirmation was insufficient?" Teller had paused. He had said the security desk is a different department from credentialing. Abrams had asked, "Had you ever previously required credentialing office confirmation to verify a hospital employee's ID in a similar situation?" Teller had said, "I do not recall a similar situation." Abrams had written in her report. Officer Teller received a complaint about a fraudulent ID. Upon arrival, he observed a black woman in nursing scrubs with a hospital ID badge on her lanyard at the staff entrance of the hospital. The hospital's security officer confirmed her employee record in the system. Officer Teller declined to accept that confirmation. He required confirmation from a department that does not open until 90 minutes after the incident began. He could not articulate why the security department's confirmation was insufficient. He could not identify a prior instance in which he had required credentialing office confirmation for a similar situation. The report also included the timeline. The report noted that Diane Osei had arrived at the staff entrance at 7:38. It noted that she had presented valid hospital credentials immediately upon contact. It noted that the hospital's security officer had confirmed her employee record at 7:41. It noted that she had not been permitted to enter until 7:44. It noted that her patients had been waiting for their scheduled nurse since 7:45. Captain Lorraine Abrams had been in the Community Relations Division for 7 years and had investigated 61 complaints in those 7 years, the majority of which had involved some version of the same pattern. An officer had formed an assessment before examining the available evidence, and the available evidence when examined had not supported the assessment. She had seen this pattern 61 times. She had documented it 61 times. She had also been in those 61 investigations the person who had conducted interviews with the complainants, the people who had been on the receiving end of the assessment that had not been supported by the available evidence. She had interviewed 61 people. They had been of different ages and different professions and different levels of familiarity with the complaint process. They had arrived at the interview in different states, some composed, some still processing the anger or fear or humiliation of what had happened. Some focused on the procedural aspects and some on the personal ones. In 61 interviews, she had observed one consistent element: every person who had been on the receiving end of an assessment that had been formed before the evidence was examined had known at the moment the assessment was applied to them that it was not based on what they had done. They had known it was based on what they looked like. They had said it differently. Some had said it directly. Some had described the incident in terms that implied it without stating it. Some had put it in their formal complaint in the precise legal language that described the mechanism without using the word that named it, but they had all known, and they had all been right. Captain Lorraine Abrams had been in the Community Relations Division for 7 years and had investigated 61 complaints in those 7 years, the majority of which had involved some version of the same pattern. An officer had formed an assessment before examining the available evidence, and the available evidence, when examined, had not supported the assessment. She had seen this pattern 61 times. She had documented it 61 times. Each time she had documented it, she had understood that the documentation was useful in 2 ways. It created a record of the specific incident that could be used in the specific complaint's resolution, and it contributed to the larger pattern that the division's annual report tracked, which was reviewed by the department's leadership, and which was in theory the mechanism by which the department identified training needs and protocol gaps. In theory. In practice, she had found that the mechanism worked slowly, and that the training that followed from the pattern documentation lagged behind the pattern by enough years that nurses and pastors and mechanics and board chairs and professors and lawyers and every other category of person who had stood in front of an officer whose assessment had been made before the evidence was examined had already filed their complaint before the training that might have prevented their situation was delivered. She had said this in her 7 years in 3 separate internal reviews. She had said it precisely. She had filed it correctly. She had continued investigating complaints. In the investigation of Diane Osei's complaint, she had found the following. She had found that Officer Teller had arrived at the staff entrance at 7:40. She had found that Diane Osei had identified herself at 7:40, had presented her hospital ID badge at 7:40, and had told the officer that the security desk had her employee record and that the credentialing office's main line was printed on the badge. She had found that Teller had looked at the badge and had asked for something else. She had found that the something else he had asked for was not specified in his incident report. She had found that the hospital security officer had confirmed Diane Osei's employee record at 7:41. She had found that Teller had declined to accept that confirmation. She had found that he had told the security officer that he needed confirmation from the credentialing office. She had found that the credentialing office opened at 8:30. She had found that Diane Osei had been detained until 7:44 when Dr. Whitfield arrived and authorized her entry. She had found that in the 6 minutes between 7:38 when Diane had arrived at the staff entrance and 7:44 when she had been authorized to enter, she had presented her hospital ID badge, her name badge, her CCU identification tag, and had verbally identified herself by name and employee number. She had been told by the security officer that her employee record matched. She had not been permitted to enter. She had found that the patient who had had the valve replacement surgery the previous afternoon had been waiting for his assigned nurse from 7:45, when the shift was supposed to begin, until 7:47 when Diane reached his bedside. She had found that the attending cardiologist had noted in the patient record at 8:15 that the patient was stable and showing expected post-operative progress with vital signs within normal range. She had found that the 2-minute delay had not produced a documented adverse outcome for the patient. She had also noted in her report that the absence of a documented adverse outcome was not the measure of whether the detention had been appropriate. The measure was whether the detention had been supported by the department's protocol. It had not been. The protocol required the officer to seek the most direct available verification. The most direct available verification had been provided and had been declined. She had found unlawful detention no articulable cause failure to use available verification resources. The investigation found Officer Teller's detention of Nurse Osei was not supported by an articulable basis under the department's protocol for investigating fraudulent identification complaints. The protocol requires officers to seek the most direct available verification of an employee's identity. The most direct available verification in this case was the hospital's security officer who confirmed the employee record while Officer Teller was still on scene. The detention that followed that confirmation was not supported by the protocol. Teller received a written reprimand and mandatory retraining. He was also required to complete a supplementary training module on the department's standard for verification of professional credentials. The module covered 3 categories of workplace credential verification: institutional ID badges, government-issued professional licenses, and employer-maintained employee registries. For each category, the module specified the primary verification source, the time standard for completing verification, and the documentation requirement when verification was completed. For hospital staff specifically, the module specified the primary verification source is the hospital's security desk. Confirmation from the security desk is sufficient. An officer who declines the security desk's confirmation and requires a higher-level confirmation is applying a standard that is not supported by the protocol. Teller completed the module. The module was added to the district's standard training library. Every officer in the district completed it in the following quarter. The documentation of that completion was part of the record that the investigation had produced. The record was growing, as records do, in both directions. It recorded what had gone wrong, and it recorded what had been done to prevent the wrong from recurring. Captain Abrams had noted in a memorandum to the division chief at the end of the quarter, the Osei matter produced a training outcome that addresses a specific protocol gap that this office has seen in 3 previous complaints involving medical facility employees. The training module closes that gap. The module should be part of the standard onboarding for officers assigned to districts that include medical facilities. The complaint from the nursing board produced a separate record which was filed with the state's Registry of incidents involving challenges to nursing credentials. The registry entry noted the incident date, the nature of the challenge, the outcome of the investigation, and the professional standing of the nurse in question, which was no disciplinary history. 14 years continuous employment dual specialty certifications, current good standing. Diane had not known when she filed the complaint with the nursing board that the registry existed. She had learned about it from a colleague in her unit, a nurse named Sandra Park, who had been working in nursing for 22 years and who had filed a registry complaint herself 6 years earlier after an incident at a different facility. Sandra had said you file it, not because it changes anything for you today. You file it because the registry is what tells the next nurse what has happened in the profession, and the profession needs to know. Diane had said who reads it. Sandra had said researchers, advocacy organizations, occasionally legislators. and nurses who are trying to understand whether what happened to them is a pattern or an isolated event. Diane had said, and is it a pattern? Sandra had been quiet for a moment. She had said the registry says yes. Sandra Park had been a registered nurse for 22 years. She had come to nursing through a different path than most of her colleagues. She had been in her early 20s, a paralegal at a civil rights law firm in another city, and had spent 3 years watching attorneys file complaints and make arguments and build records on behalf of clients whose situations were in many ways the product of institutions that had treated them as a category rather than as specific people with specific rights. She had decided at 25 that she wanted to be the person in the room when the specific person needed something specific, not the person who came later to document what had happened. She had gone to nursing school. She had been in nursing for 22 years. She had filed the nursing board registry complaint 6 years earlier after an incident at a different facility in which a patient's family member had questioned in front of 3 other patients and their visitors whether she was the actual nurse assigned to the patient or whether the actual nurse was coming. She had handled the incident in the moment with the precision of a person who has been a paralegal and who understands what is happening legally and professionally and personally when a thing like that is said in a room with witnesses. She had said calmly and directly, "I am Sandra Park. I am the registered nurse assigned to your family member. I have been at this facility for 8 years. I am happy to introduce you to my charge nurse if you would like additional confirmation. Is there something about your family member's care I can help you with?" The family member had not asked for the charge nurse. She had filed the complaint that evening. She had said when she told Diane about it, "I filed it not because anything changed from filing it." The moment had passed. My patient was fine. The family member was embarrassed. Everything continued. I filed it because the registry needed to know that it happened, and because the nurse at a different facility 3 years from now, who has the same thing happen and who wonders whether it is a pattern, needs the registry to say yes, it is a pattern, and here are the documented instances, and here is what those nurses did about it. Diane had said, "And what did you do about it?" Sandra had said, "I filed the complaint, precisely, through the correct channel. And then I went back to my patient and took care of him." Diane had said, and that was enough. Sandra had been quiet. She had said it was what was possible, and it was what the next person needed me to do. So yes, it was enough. Diane had filed the complaint. She had filed it precisely. She had filed it through the correct channel. The complaint was in the registry. The registry was maintained by the state's nursing board and contained, as of the date of Diane's entry, 412 documented incidents in which a nursing professional's credentials had been challenged without articulable cause. The incidents spanned 17 years. They covered 31 counties. They involved nurses of varying specialties, varying years of experience, varying levels of certification and education. They had one element in common. Every nurse in the registry was a black woman, not by design. The registry was not organized by race. The registry was organized by incident type, date, facility, and outcome. But Sandra Park had told Diane about the registry by saying, "I filed the complaint not because it changes anything for you today, because the registry is what tells the next nurse what has happened in the profession." And she had said the registry says, yes, it is a pattern. And the registry said yes. It said yes in a way that was not ambiguous. 412 incidents, 17 years, 31 counties, every nurse a black woman. Diane had read the registry summary that the Nursing Board's Advocacy Division published annually after Sandra had mentioned it. She had sat with it for a long time. She had not been surprised. She had been in the specific way that a person who has known something and has been carrying it alone is when they see it confirmed and documented, relieved. She had said to Sandra, when I read the registry summary, I felt I do not know exactly how to describe it. Sandra had said you felt that you were not the first. Diane had said yes. Sandra had said, and that the ones who came before had done something with it. Diane had said yes. Sandra had said that is why the registry exists. Not to tell you you are not alone. You already knew that, even if you had not seen the number. It exists to tell you that the ones who came before used the correct channel, and that the channel works, and that the record is there. Diane had said, and the record matters. Sandra had said the record always matters. It just matters on a different timeline than we sometimes want it to. Diane had filed the complaint. She had added one to the count. She had joined the 412. She had been one more nurse who had taken the credential card and the complaint form and the registry entry and the precise language and had said, "The accurate answer is this. It is in the correct channel. It is in the format the system is required to process." The complaint was in the registry. The registry was part of the record. The record was for the nurse who came after. Dr. Meredith Whitfield was 53 years old and had been in hospital administration for 22 years, having come to it after a decade as a practicing physician in internal medicine. She had grown up in Cincinnati, the daughter of a social worker and a middle school principal, and had come to medicine because she had understood from watching both parents that the institutions a society builds to care for its people are only as good as the people inside them who hold the standard. She had held the standard for 32 years. She had also run to the Callahan Street entrance and had said this nurse belongs inside this building. She had meant it in every sense in which that sentence could be meant. She had gone back to her office. She had called the chief. She had said the 2 minutes are real minutes. The chief had said, "I hear you." She had gone back to work. She had been in hospital administration for 22 years. She had gone to medical school at 22, had done her residency in internal medicine, and had practiced for 10 years in a clinic serving a low-income urban neighborhood in the mid-Atlantic before she had made the specific considered decision to move into administration. She had made the decision not because she had wanted to stop practicing medicine, but because she had understood after 10 years in the clinic that the care her patients received was shaped at least as much by the institutional decisions made above her as by the clinical decisions she made at the bedside. The availability of certain medications, the hours of the clinic, the referral pathways, the staffing levels on any given day. These were administrative decisions made in rooms she was not in, by people who were making them with information that she had from her patient's experience that they did not have from wherever they were sitting. She had decided that she wanted to be in those rooms. She had gone back to school. She had earned an MBA with a concentration in healthcare management. She had taken an administrative fellowship at a large academic medical center in the Northeast. She had spent 12 years in increasingly senior administrative roles before being offered the executive directorship at Meridian City General. She had been at Meridian City General for 11 years. In those 11 years, she had navigated 3 major regulatory audits, 2 construction projects, 1 significant shift in the hospital's payer mix as a result of insurance market changes, and the specific ongoing challenge of retaining experienced clinical staff in a labor market that made retention difficult. She had not navigated a situation in which one of her nurses had been detained at the staff entrance by a police officer. She had run. She had arrived in time. She had said, "This nurse belongs inside this building." She had said it as the hospital's executive director. She had also said it as a physician who had spent 10 years watching what happened to patients when the people who were supposed to be caring for them were not there. She had said it as a woman who had spent 22 years working in a system that did not always immediately see her the way her credentials said she was, and who had learned from that experience the specific combination of directness and precision that was required to navigate those situations without losing either the clarity of what you knew or the composure that made the knowing useful. She had said this nurse belongs inside this building. She had said it once clearly with the full weight of 11 years as executive director and 10 years as a physician and 22 years of understanding what it looked like when a system failed to see a person clearly. Diane had gone. Dr. Meredith Whitfield had been the executive director of Meridian City General Hospital for 11 years and had not in those 11 years ever run to a staff entrance. She had run on the morning of the incident and had arrived in time to authorize Diane's entry and to provide to Officer Teller the personal direct statement of a hospital executive director that the nurse in front of him was the nurse she said she was. She had gone back to her office. She had called the chief of police. She had said, "I want to discuss what happened this morning at my hospital's staff entrance." The chief had said, "I am aware of the incident. An investigation has been initiated." She had said, "Good. I want to tell you something that I want to be part of the conversation that follows the investigation, which is that one of the reasons this incident took as long as it did is that the officer on scene required a form of verification that is available only 90 minutes after the start of the nursing shift. If the officer had accepted the security desk's confirmation, which is the first and most accessible form of verification available at a hospital entrance, the incident would have been over in 3 minutes instead of 6. The chief had said, "That is correct. The protocol error is that specific." She had said, "I also want to say that Diane Osei is one of the best nurses in my cardiac care unit, and that the 2 minutes she was delayed from reaching a post-operative cardiac patient are not abstract. They are real minutes in which a real patient was without his nurse. I want that to be in the training conversation." The chief had said it will be. She had said, "Thank you." The chief of police had said, "I am aware of the incident. An investigation has been initiated." Dr. Whitfield had said, "I want to add one thing for the record. The verification protocol failure in this case was specific and correctable. The protocol requires the officer to use the most direct available verification. At a hospital staff entrance, the most direct available verification is the hospital's security desk. The hospital's security desk has employee records. The security desk confirmed this nurse's identity. The officer declined to accept that confirmation. That specific decision, not the initial approach, but the decision to reject the security desk's confirmation, is the correctable element. I want the training that follows from this complaint to address that specific decision specifically." The chief had said, "I hear you. I will communicate that to Captain Abrams." Dr. Whitfield had said one more thing. The chief had said yes. She had said, "This nurse is one of the best nurses in my cardiac care unit. She has been here for 14 years. She was 2 minutes late to a post-operative cardiac patient because she was standing at the staff entrance of her own hospital, waiting for a police officer to accept the confirmation that the security desk had already provided. I want you to understand that when I say 2 minutes in cardiac post-operative care is not nothing I am speaking clinically, not rhetorically." The chief had been quiet. She had said, "I understand." Dr. Whitfield had said good. She had gone back to her work. The chief had called Diane 2 days after the investigation had concluded. She had said, "Ms. Osei, I am Chief Doreen Ibarra. I have reviewed the investigation report, the complaint from the hospital, and your personal account. I am calling to tell you that the investigation's finding is correct and that the reprimand and retraining are appropriate, and also to tell you that I have asked Captain Abrams to brief the full district on the specific protocol violation, in this case, the failure to accept the security desk's confirmation. Every officer in this district is going to know what the correct procedure is for verifying an employee's identity at a workplace where the employer has a security desk with employment records available." Diane had said, "I appreciate that, Chief." The chief had said, "I also want to say something that is not in the investigation report and that I want to say directly. The complaint you filed was precise and complete. The timeline, the words of each exchange, the clinical information about your patient's condition. That precision is what made the investigation efficient and the finding clear. Thank you for being precise." Diane had said, "My mother taught me to put the accurate answer in the correct channel." The chief had been quiet for a moment. She had said, "Your mother sounds like someone worth listening to." Diane had said she taught English and literature for 22 years. She was very precise about language. The chief had said, "I can tell." She had said, "Is there anything else you would like to tell me about the incident that is not in the complaint?" Diane had thought about it. She had said, "I want to tell you what I was thinking while I was standing at the staff entrance." The chief had said, "Please." She had said, "I was thinking about my patients, specifically about the valve replacement from the night before, who was 18 hours post-operative and who was in the phase of recovery that requires the most careful monitoring. I was not thinking about the officer or the complaint or whether I was going to be late. I was thinking about whether Priya had done the 7:30 vital check and what the numbers were, because those were the things I was responsible for. The situation at the staff entrance was going to be resolved. I knew it was going to be resolved. The question was how long it would take and what was happening to my patients while I was waiting." The chief had said, "That is a very specific kind of clarity." Diane had said, "It is what the job requires." She had said, "I will also tell you, and I want to say this not as a complaint, but as an observation. that I have been a nurse at this hospital for 14 years. I have a hospital ID badge. I have a name badge. I have a CCU tag. I have a credential card. I carry the credential card because I understood early in my career that I might be in situations where the badge on my lanyard was not going to be immediately accepted as sufficient. I prepared for those situations. I was in one of them on Saturday morning. I was prepared for it. But the fact that I prepared for it does not mean the situation was appropriate. It was not appropriate. It was just something I was prepared for. The chief had been quiet for a long time. She had said that is in the record now. Diane had said, I know, I put it there. She had gone back to her work. There was a hospital to run. She had been running it for 11 years. She would run it for however many years it needed to be run, one morning at a time, one crisis at a time, one staff entrance, incident at a time, if that was what it required. She had run to the Callahan Street entrance and had said this nurse belongs inside this building. That was the correct thing to say. That was what the evidence supported. That was what Dr. Whitfield had said. Diane Osei had gone to her patients. The patient who had had the valve replacement surgery the previous afternoon had been in his bed. His name was Walter Grimes. He was 67 years old, a retired school bus driver who had worked for 31 years in the county's public school transportation system, and who had in those 31 years driven his route with a level of consistency and care that had produced over the course of his career a reputation among the families on his routes as the driver who always waited if a child was late, who always knew which child was having a difficult morning, and who had on one occasion that had become something of a local legend in the neighborhood where he had worked. His longest route noticed that a child on his bus was running a fever severe enough to be concerning, had contacted the school's nurse before the bus arrived, and had ensured that the child's parents were notified within the hour. He had had his aortic valve replaced the previous afternoon. He had been in his bed when Diane came in. He had looked up when she came in. He had said, "You are later than usual." She had said, "I apologize for the delay. I am here now. How are you feeling?" He had said, "The ache is there, but it is different from yesterday's ache." She had said, "Tell me about the difference." He had described it. She had listened with the specific expert attention of a nurse who has been in cardiac care for 9 years, and who knows that the way a patient describes their sensation is as important as any reading on any monitor, because the patient is the only one inside the body, and the description is a form of data that the monitors cannot capture. She had checked his chart. She had checked his vitals. She had assessed the incision. She had checked his medication levels. She had noted in the chart, patient describes sensation change from previous day, consistent with expected post-operative tissue response. Vitals within normal range. Incision site, clear, no signs of infection. Medication levels appropriate. Patient alert and oriented, no indication of complication. He had said, watching her write, "You are very thorough." She had said, "That is the job." He had said, "I had a different nurse last night." She had said, "That was Priya. She works nights. She is very good." He had said she was, but she is not you. She had said, "We are both good. You are in good hands either way." He had looked at her for a moment. He had said, "I drove a school bus for 31 years. She had said, "I know. It is in your intake notes." He had said, "You read the intake notes." She had said, "I read everything." He had said, 31 years. The kids on that bus, some of them are adults now. I have had parents come up to me in the grocery store 10 years later to say, "You drove my kid. Thank you for what I always said. For being the same person every morning they always said. For being someone the kids could count on." Diane had looked at him. He had said, "I think that is what you are." She had been quiet. She had said, "I try to be." He had said, "You have been here, 2 years, since I last had the cardiac checkup." She had said, "I have been in this unit for 9 years. I may have had you for checkups over the years. I would need to check the records." He had said, 9 years. "And you are still this careful." She had said, "The care is not what diminishes. The standard is the standard." He had said, "Good." She had said, "I feel safer when you are here." She had paused. She had said, "I am glad. That is the job." She had moved to the next patient. She had 4 patients that morning. She had assessed all 4 by 8:15. She had gone back to Walter Grimes at 8:30 for the medication check. He had been awake. He had said, "I was thinking about what I said earlier." about being the same person every morning. She had said yes. He had said, "I think the reason the parents remembered it was not that I did anything special. It was that I did the same thing every day for long enough that the children and the families knew they could count on it. The consistency was the thing." She had said, "I think that is right." He had said, "How long have you been doing it?" She had said, 14 years, 9 in this unit. He had said, "And have you always done it the same way?" She had said, "The methods improve as I learn more. The standard does not change." He had nodded. He had said that is the same thing. She had checked his medication levels and had updated his chart and had moved to her next patient. She had been at the hospital doing the work she had been trained for 14 years to do in the building she had been trying to enter since 738. The complaint was in the record. The registry entry was in the record. The investigation finding was in the record. The timeline was in the record. 7:38, Diane Osei arrives at the staff entrance with valid credentials. 7:44, Dr. Whitfield authorizes her entry. 7:47, Diane Osei is at her post-operative patient's bedside. The record said what it said. It said a nurse had arrived at work on time in uniform with credentials and had been delayed from her patients for 6 minutes because an officer had received an anonymous complaint and had decided before examining any of the available evidence that the decision had already been made. The registry said what it said. It said this was not an isolated event. The investigation said what it said. It said the protocol had been violated. The detention had not been supported. The most direct available verification had been ignored. And Diane Osei's account, which was in the folder in the filing cabinet, said what it said. It said I was 2 minutes late to a patient who had had valve replacement surgery 18 hours earlier. She had written that sentence at 9:15 in the evening after her daughter was asleep at the kitchen table in the house where she had been living for 7 years in the city where she had been working for 14. She had written it precisely. She had known what she was writing. She had been writing for the next nurse. She had been writing for the nurse who would stand at a staff entrance somewhere in this country and be told that the credential she carried was not sufficient evidence that she was who it said she was, and who would need to know that the question she was being asked was not a question about her credentials. It was a question about her, and the answer was in the record. The answer was 14 years. The answer was 9 years in cardiac care. The answer was 4 post-operative patients who needed her at 7:45. The answer was the patient who had said, "I feel safer when you are here." The answer was she was here. She had been here for 14 years. She was going to be here for 14 more. The record would be here when she arrived, and when the nurse who came after her arrived, and when the system was finally ready to read what the record had been saying all along. The record was ready. It had always been ready. Diane Osei had filed it precisely in the correct language through the correct channels at 9:15 in the evening after her daughter was asleep at the kitchen table the day it happened. She had gone to bed. She had been at work at 7:38 the following morning. Meridian City General Hospital had been operating on its current site for 44 years. It had been through 3 major expansions, 2 changes in name, 4 changes in chief executive, and 1 period in the late 1990s in which the hospital's financial position had been sufficiently uncertain that a merger with a larger regional system had been proposed, and then, after a period of community opposition and internal restructuring, declined. The hospital had stayed. The cardiac care unit had been established in 1983. It had been at its founding a 4-bed unit with 2 nurses per shift and a single attending cardiologist, who rotated through on a schedule that the current department would have found inadequate for the patient load. It was now a 22-bed unit with a full nursing staff, 2 attending cardiologists per shift, and the specific accumulated expertise of a department that had been doing the same work for 41 years and that knew from 41 years of doing it what the work required. Diane Osei had been in that unit for 9 of its 41 years. In 9 years, she had cared for hundreds of patients in the specific critical phase of cardiac recovery. That is the most demanding and the most important. The first 48 hours after a procedure, when the trajectory of recovery is being established, and when the quality of nursing attention is the primary variable that determines whether the trajectory is good. She had brought to each of those patients the specific expert 14 years of nursing, including 9 in cardiac attention, that her training and her experience and her natural capacity for the particular kind of observation that good cardiac nursing requires had produced. She had brought to the staff entrance on the Callahan Street side on the morning of the incident the same thing she brought to every shift: her hospital ID badge, her name badge, her CCU identification tag, her credential card, and the 14 years of experience and credentialing that those documents represented. She had been told to wait. She had waited. She had been 6 minutes late to a post-operative cardiac patient who had needed her at 7:45. She had been there at 7:47. She had done the work. The work had been done. The record had been filed. Kwame Osei had built 47 bridges in 38 years. He had built them with the specific patient long-term commitment of a man who understood that the bridge was not finished when the construction was finished, but when it had proven over years and decades of use that it would hold. He had also built them with documentation. Every bridge project had a record: the design specifications, the materials, the construction timeline, the load testing, the inspection reports, the maintenance records. The record was not secondary to the bridge. The record was what allowed the bridge to be maintained. It was what allowed a future engineer to understand what had been built and how and why, so that when the bridge needed to be repaired or expanded or eventually replaced, the decisions could be made with the benefit of what the record contained. He had said to Diane when she was in her first year of nursing and had complained about the volume of documentation required, the documentation is not the job. It is the record of the job. They are different things, but they are not separate things. The documentation is how the job survives beyond the person who did it. She had said, "I just want to care for the patients." He had said, "You will care for the patients for 30 years if you are consistent. When you retire, someone else will care for the patients in the unit you built. They will be able to do it well because the record you kept will tell them what the patients needed and how you provided it and what worked and what did not. The documentation is not for you. It is for the patients who come after the patients you cared for." She had said, "That is a very long way of thinking about it." He had said, "The bridges I build will be here for 100 years. The people who drive across them in 2080 will not know my name. They will know the bridge. They will know it because the record of how I built it was kept." She had thought about that for a long time. Diane had thought about that sometimes in the cardiac care unit when a patient had recovered and had been discharged and had gone home, and she had known from the work she had done in the first 48 hours that the recovery had gone the way it had gone in part because of the quality of the attention that the patient had received in those hours. The bridge would hold. The patient had crossed. The nurse, like the bridge, had been invisible in the crossing. That was the point. She had also thought about what her mother had said the day she had called to tell her about the incident, and about the complaint, and about the registry entry, and about what Captain Abrams had found. Abena had listened to all of it. She had been quiet for a moment. She had said, "I want to tell you something." Diane had said yes. She had said, "In 22 years of teaching, I had students who understood what I was teaching on the first encounter, and students who needed to encounter it 10 times before it became part of how they thought." The work of teaching was not different between those two students. The work was the same. The pace was different. I was the same teacher for both. I brought the same attention, the same precision, the same expectation. The student's pace did not change what I brought. Diane had said, and the institution's pace, the pace at which it recognizes what you are, does not change what you bring. Abena had said exactly. Diane had said, "You have been telling me this my whole life." Abena had said, "You have been listening your whole life, I can tell." Diane had said, "Mama." Abena had said, "Yes." Diane had said, "I filed it precisely." Abena had said, "I know, I read the complaint, you sent it to me." Diane had said, "What did you think?" Abena had been quiet. She had said, "I thought she sounds like her mother." Diane had laughed, the specific laugh of a woman who has had a long day and who is on the phone with her mother, and who knows from the laugh alone that everything is going to be all right. Not because the institution is going to immediately become what it needs to be, but because she knows what she knows, and she has put it in the record, and she is going to be at work at 7:38 tomorrow morning. She had called her father the following Saturday. She had told him what had happened. Kwame Osei had been quiet. He had said, "What did you do?" She had said, "I stood there. I showed my credentials. I waited for the situation to be resolved. I went to my patients. I filed the complaint. I went back to work." He had been quiet for another moment. He had said you did what the situation required. She had said yes. He had said, and the record says what happened. She had said yes. He had said good. He had said the bridge is what the bridge is. The person crossing it is not thinking about the bridge, but the bridge holds. The bridge holds because of the engineer who built it, and because of the standard she held to, and because of the record she kept. The bridge holds because the record is there. She had said yes, Baba. He had said you are the bridge. She had said I know. He had said I have always known. She had said I know that too. She had been at the hospital at 7:38 the morning after the phone call. She had been at the hospital at 7:38 every morning since. The department following the investigation had implemented the supplementary training that Dr. Whitfield had requested. The training had been delivered to all officers in the district. It had covered the specific protocol for verifying employee credentials at workplaces where the employer had an accessible security desk. The first step was the security desk, and the security desk's confirmation was sufficient. The training had also covered the specific categories of professional identification that were standard for different types of workplace hospital staff, emergency services, building, management, transportation, and what each category of identification typically contained and how to verify it. Captain Abrams had attended the training. She had also sent a summary of the training to the hospital's security director as a professional courtesy so that the security team would know what the officers in the district had been trained on. The security director had forwarded the summary to Dr. Whitfield. Dr. Whitfield had read it. She had said to her assistant, file this with the Osei matter. Her assistant had filed it. The record now contained the complaint, the investigation, the reprimand, the apology, the chief's call, the training summary, and Dr. Whitfield's call to the chief. It contained everything that had happened. It contained it precisely. It would be there for the next hospital director who needed to know what had happened at this staff entrance and what the response had been. It would be there for the next officer assigned to this district who needed to know what the protocol required. It would be there for the next nurse who stood at a staff entrance and needed to know what had been filed by the nurse who had stood there before her. Diane had said to Amara 2 months after the incident on a Saturday morning when they were at the kitchen table and Amara was doing her reading assignment and Diane was reviewing her nursing board continuing education log. Amara had said, "Mama, what are you doing?" Diane had said, "I am keeping track of my professional education. Every nurse has to document that they are continuing to learn." Amara had said, "Even when you already know a lot." Diane had said, especially then, "The more you know, the more you understand about what you do not know yet." Amara had thought about that. She had said, "Is that why you went through what happened at the hospital?" Because there was something else to learn. Diane had been quiet. She had said, "I learned some things from it, yes." Amara had said, "What did you learn?" Diane had said, "I learned that the record I filed was the right record to file. I learned that the process works even when it is slow. I learned that the nurses who filed complaints before me made it possible for my complaint to be understood clearly." Amara had said, "Because they did it first." Diane had said, "Yes." Amara had said, "And someone after you will be glad you did it." Diane had said, "Yes." Amara had said, "I want to be a nurse." Diane had been very still for a moment. She had said, "Why?" Amara had said, "Because you are one, and it seems like it is hard, but also like it is important." Diane had said, "It is both." Amara had said, "And you always go back." Diane had said, "Yes." Amara had said, "Every morning." Diane had said, "Every morning." Amara had gone back to her reading assignment. Diane had gone back to her continuing education log. She had been at the hospital at 7:38 the morning after that conversation. She had been at the hospital at 7:38 every morning since. She would be at the hospital at 7:38 the following morning, and every morning after that, for however many mornings the work needed to be done. The credential card was in her front pocket. The badge was on the lanyard. The work was at the end of the corridor in the 22-bed cardiac care unit where the patients were. She was there. She had always been there. The record said so. The record was for the nurse who came after. The nurse who came after would know this is what the work is. This is what the credential represents. This is what the badge on the lanyard means. This is what you do when you are told to wait at the entrance of the building where you have worked for 14 years. You wait. You are precise. You file the complaint in the correct channel, in the correct language, at the correct time. And then you go to your patients. Because the patients are why you are there. The patients are always why you are there. And you are the nurse. You have been the nurse for 14 years. You will be the nurse tomorrow. The work is what it is, and the credential is what it is, and the record is what it is, and you are who you are. and you are at work at 7:38 in the morning. You always are. Diane Osei had been at work at 7:38 the morning after the incident, and at 7:38 every morning since. She had been at the bedside of Walter Grimes, the retired school bus driver who had had his aortic valve replaced and who had said, "I feel safer when you are here." She had said, "That is the job." She had been at the bedside of 3 other patients on the same morning, and at the bedside of different patients on different mornings, and she had brought to each of them the specific expert-sustained attention that 14 years of nursing and 9 years of cardiac care had produced. She had also been at the kitchen table at 9:15 on the evening of the incident writing precisely. She had also been at the nursing board registry filing precisely. She had also been on the phone with her mother, listening to a woman who had spent 22 years teaching English and literature say you filed it precisely. I can tell. She had also been in the elevator with Priya receiving the overnight notes on the morning of the incident 4 minutes after the handcuffs had been on her hospital director's authorization, her lanyard badge and her credential card, and her 14 years and the uninterrupted sequence of her career. She had been all of those things. She was all of those things. The credential was not separate from the person. The record was not separate from the credential. The work was not separate from the record. They were the same thing. A woman who had been building something for 14 years that could not be fraudulent because it was built from the inside out, from the actual work of caring for actual patients, from the actual learning of the actual standard, from the actual filing of the actual complaint in the actual correct channel. The badge on the lanyard was the outside of that thing. The inside was 14 years. The inside was the valve replacement patient who had looked up when she came in and who had said, "You are later than usual." The inside was Walter Grimes, who had said the bridge is the same whether the person crossing it knows your name or not. He had not said that, but he had said, "I feel safer when you are here," which was the same thing, which was always the same thing, which was what the work produced when you did it for long enough. The credential was in the registry. The registry was in the record. The record was for the nurse who came after. And the nurse who came after was going to be at the staff entrance at 7:38 in the morning with her badge on her lanyard and her credential card in her pocket, and 14 years or 9 years or 5 years or 2 years of the actual work behind her. And she was going to be a black woman. And she was going to be stopped. And she was going to show her badge and say her name and wait for the situation to be resolved. And she was going to go to her patients. And she was going to file the complaint precisely in the correct channel, in the correct language. And she was going to add her entry to the registry. And she was going to be at work at 7:38 the following morning. Because that is what the work requires. Because that is what the patients need. Because that is who she is. Because the record says so. The record has always said so. The record is the work. The work continues. 14 years of the same work done to the same standard. 7:38 in the morning. Every morning. The badge on the lanyard and the credential card in the pocket and the overnight notes read in the elevator and the first patient's name and the first patient's face and the 14 years behind her and the 14 more ahead. The patients at the end of the corridor waiting for a nurse they can count on. The names in the chart precise. The accurate answer in the correct channel also precise. The complaint in the registry adding 1 to the count for the nurse who comes after. The work. Always the work.